This morning's conversation, as you all know, was about Congress and the prospects for immigration reform. And I think we all heard that the consensus seemed to be that while there were certainly possibilities for the House of Representatives still acting, if not this year, sometime early next year, the consensus of the panel seemed to be that they might not act as broadly as a lot of us had originally hoped for. And so we wanted to have this afternoon's discussion on the rest of the world, or at least on the rest of the country. And even if Washington is still at loggerheads and they may or may not pass a bill at some point in 2014, there's all sorts of good work and progress and activity taking place around the country. I'm going to introduce our panelists very quickly, and then we'll get this discussion started. Sitting right next to me here is my friend Mike Madrid. Mike is currently the principal of Grassroots Lab. He's also the editor and publisher of California City News. He's the former public affairs director of the League of California Cities, and he helped develop the Leadership California Institute, a League of Cities initiative that trains local leaders to run for legislature and state office. Roxana is an intern at the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund at MALDEF, and she's an undergrad here at the University of Southern California. Many of you know Professor Suro, but if on the off chance that you don't, Roberto is currently the director of the Tomás Rivera Policy Institute here at SC. He's a professor at both the Annenberg and the Price schools, and he's the former director of the Pew Hispanic Center. And last and certainly not least is Cindy Chang. Cindy is a reporter covering immigration issues for the Los Angeles Times. She's previously reported for the New Orleans Times-Picayune and the Pasadena Star News, but probably watches these issues closer than any journalist in Los Angeles, if not in California. Roberto, I'm going to start with you, because as I mentioned a moment ago, this morning's conversation was about the debate in Congress, and we want to shift this conversation to the rest of the country. But it seems to me one of the things that I've learned from talking to you and the work you've been doing is even when it comes to the legislation in Congress, there's an emerging disconnect between Washington, D.C. and the rest of the country, some emerging differences of opinions, in particular on some of the things our previous panel was talking about, most notably the question of a bill that includes a pathway to citizenship and whether it includes a legalization status, somewhat sort of citizenship. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that discussion and debate is evolving.
Well, I'll use that as a brief starting point. So there's the idea of citizenship as the end point of a legalization process has been a desirable, almost universal goal of immigration reformers now since this debate, the current round of this debate started almost a decade ago, maybe a little more. The question is how far out that endpoint is, how much of the unauthorized population gets to it. And there's a lot of room there between everybody getting citizenship in a short period of time to some share of this population ending up with citizenship eventually. The current round of legislative attempted policymaking has that issue has been one of the center focuses of disagreement, and one of the issues that has produced a stalemate with one side, the framers of the Senate bill, insisting that no matter how you do it, there's got to be a very explicit understanding that citizenship is the end point, and a lot of House Republicans saying we'll do everything but that. So there's it's not quite the 11th hour, maybe the 10th hour, a negotiation that a lot of people expected. It's part of the natural course of things in Washington that you, at a certain point, you start doing a little horse trade to see where maybe there's a possibility of a compromise on this. I mean, where the disconnect comes that Dan was talking about is that if you go to the people who are most affected by this, by unauthorized migrants themselves and their families, their priorities start with protection from deportation, particularly given the kind of enforcement regime we've been living with in the last 5 years, where about 400,000 people a year are being forcibly removed from the country. Secondly would be the ability to work here legally and to be able to travel in and out of the country without having to deal with a smuggler. Citizenship comes along somewhere after that in most households. So the question is how you, it's a complicated political calculus as to how these priorities are set that we don't necessarily have to go into here. I'm going to take this opportunity to segue into the topic of the panel. So, I mean, all of our focus here this morning has been on the idea of federal policy making, and it's undoubtedly important. And there's no question in this country, particularly following there was a Supreme Court decision about a law that Arizona passed 2 years ago, which laid out very clearly, reinforced the notion that the federal government has really the unchallenged authority to decide who comes into the country, how many people and what types are allowed to enter the country. But that's only the very first step in the process of running a country that has large-scale immigration. When 13% of your population is foreign-born, the simple act of admission, which we kind of get obsessed about, and we get obsessed about one little piece of it in particular, which is people who evade the federal policies on admission. That leaves the much larger question of what happens, after people get here. All the questions of their trajectories going forward, how their professional qualifications are translated into American terms, how they learn English, how their children are looked after, a whole series of questions. But beyond that, this immigration debate highlights the extent to which even after, if you get any kind of statutory reform of immigration policy in Washington, the burden for then implementing a great deal of that policy comes down to states and municipalities. So, to give you one example, say the Senate bill was passed tomorrow, magically. It says that 60 days after that bill appears in the Federal Register, a 1-year registration period opens for unauthorized immigrants who want to come under the umbrella of legalization. In the Los Angeles area, there are probably, well, best guess, maybe 900,000 unauthorized migrants, and probably 6 million or so would qualify under the terms of the Senate bill. Do the math and figure out what it would take to register 6 million people in 365 days. This would be a massive undertaking. So whatever happens in Washington, a great deal of responsibility then flows down. And we actually have although we focus on Washington, we have a very hybrid policy regime in this country where states and municipalities and neighborhoods and families, school districts, hospitals all play a role in this much larger process of trying to achieve success in the process of immigration. I'll give you one other simple example. I mean, California has, in the last year, taken a number of big steps. One very notably on driver's licenses. So on or before January 1st, 2015, the California DMV has to start giving driver's licenses to people regardless of their immigration status. You go back to the numbers, and this will be a big undertaking. I mean, this will require hundreds of thousands of people to come forward. It's going to be entirely managed at the state and local level, and there's a lot of work now taking place in a big hurry to try and get the infrastructure in place that will be necessary to carry out this kind of civic task of going to that population and saying, okay, step forward, identify yourselves to a government agency without legalization, because it's the right thing to do, and we're going to help you do it, because it's really important. It's incredibly important to the city. It's incredibly important to people who advocate on behalf of immigration. It's important in terms of just managing all kinds of civic processes to have people, the first opportunity to have a genuine identity document issued by an American government agency in California that has a certain kind of validity, that has, that puts them in the civic space. So this becomes a big enterprise. And I'm delighted that this panel is going to sort of turn its attention from Washington to where the rest, in some cases, most of the action takes place, which is state and locally.
Roberto, thank you very much. Michael Madrid, let me ask you this, because you've worked at both the state and local level for a lot of years. One of the points that Kevin De Leon made this morning, as I think many of you remember, is he talked about how not just the substantive progress here was markedly different than Washington, but how the tone of the discussion was so much different. And that whether the driver's license debate was taking place in Sacramento this year, unlike the debate in Washington, and unlike the debate in Sacramento 10 years ago,
Right.
Even when two people or two sides disagreed, it was not nearly as nasty or vitriolic as it had been. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how that difference in tone sets a different context for the discussion.
Well, look, I think that tone is everything in this debate. And I think there's, again, we're going to try to stay away from the federal discussion, the discussion in Congress, but both sides, I think, have managed this very, very poorly. And it leaves us where we're at right now. Having said that, California, as it often is very instructive. What happens in California often is a prelude to what's going to happen nationwide. The most fascinating thing about the debate, to me, in my mind, with the driver's license bill, was that for the first time in 10 years, as you pointed out, this bill has made it to the floor, for a decade now. The attacks were not coming from the right, traditionally from the Republicans, with their standard immigration talking points. The attacks, actually, the bill was pulled. The people who were watching this, the bill was pulled with about an hour left on the clock to get the bill done because of attacks from the left, right? Saying the undocumented aren't protected enough in this bill. And you were not seeing any concerns or hackles or concerns raised from the right side of the aisle because of I think, the political realities that finally, after a decade of losing, Republicans have finally realized this is not an issue, or at least this way of approaching the issue is not going to be a winner for us. So it's fascinating to see not just the tone, but where there was concern was coming from the opposite side of the political spectrum. And that is instructive for a number of reasons. The first is, I think, that we've got to keep in mind that California has been struggling with many of these issues, as the doctor pointed out, for at least 10 years. I would argue probably going back to the mid-1990s. And there have been some successes, some failures. But what's happening is Washington's inability to act is increasingly requiring states, and not just states, but also municipalities, local governments, to start affirmatively taking positions on something that they really don't have much authority in doing legally, right? We always think of immigration as being the role of the federal government, but the implementation, as was correctly pointed out, requires a lot of engagement from state and locals. Well, what does that mean, Mike? Well, what it means is it explains in large part why you had the whole sanctuary city movement start 6, 7, 8 years ago, where municipalities, cities, especially in Los Angeles County, were saying, no, we're not going to be part of the federal practice. Engaging proactively, and that's an important word when we're talking about tone, by saying this is what we're not going to do as a government. The state, of course, has grappled with everything from driver's licenses with the undocumented to whether or not we can find a legalization to generate, sales tax or income tax revenue for those, to providing some sort of documentation from the government to provide a safer harbor of how this federal framework of immigration should look. And I think for good reason. But I also think that we're probably at a point where we're recognizing that the comprehensive package has a very slim likelihood of passing. I think something will get done, but I think it's going to be a first step. It's not going to be the end of the discussion, and that will probably happen sometime in the next year, probably the early part of the year. But I don't think anybody on any side of the aisle believes that that's going to be the end. And for the first time, at least in the past, since the mid-60s when we first tackled immigration reform, we will be looking at a series of steps to getting there. And there's no question that state governments are going to have a big say in that. I think they already have. The path that they take as states, I think, is going to be very determinative in what the ultimate packages look like. Local governments have been very influential in that process as well. And I think for states with the initiative process, I think will wield an inordinate amount of power, because I think that there will probably be measures either placed by the legislature or through the initiative process by gathering signatures of the people. There will be statements about how people want this issue addressed, not just in California, but nationwide.
Mike, thanks very much. And I'd love to come back to that initiative discussion in a moment, because along with everything else, there's a tremendous irony, and a welcome irony there, if that ends up being the course of forward action. But let me ask Cindy a question. Cindy, like I said earlier, from the Times you watch these things very, very carefully, both the public debate but also public attitudes. And the lowering of the volume, the easing of the rhetoric, that hasn't happened by accident. And it hasn't happened necessarily as a result of political advocacy, but for broader community-based changes. In other words, Californians feel differently about these issues now than they did 20 years ago, not because candidates tell them to, but because of their own experiences. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how those broader forces shape public opinion.
A lot of this conversation, particularly this morning, has been about the dysfunction of our political system. Yet, ultimately, it still is what people think that matters. And I think a lot of times in these discussions, the sort of subtleties of how people view these issues are lost. And, I get these press releases all the time, like, Asian American women think this about immigration, or, Latinos think this, but really when you actually go out and talk to normal people, even those who will, at first blush say, I don't think they should, get any benefits because they're not supposed to be here, but you keep on talking to them, and in the end they'll say, and I actually quoted somebody like this at the end of one of my stories, who said, it's complicated. They're human beings, and so I know that we can't just deport them all, and let's just find a fair way to do it. And so, if you're thinking about the next 2 to 3 months, maybe things don't look good for comprehensive immigration reform. But if you look at it from a longer term, and you look at what California has been through in the last 2 decades, I mean, from Prop 187 to, this slate of immigration measures that we passed this past legislative session, I mean, it's quite striking, and the basis of that is changes in public opinion.
And Roxana, all jokes aside, that's who you work with through your internship at MALDEF. Not legislators, not congressmen, but men and women and families who face, day-to-day needs and challenges. And the impression I get from what you told me in the past is that the work you do there has much less to do with the formal political system than it has to do with those more immediate challenges. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you see during your work at MALDEF.
So in addition to my work at MALDEF, I also volunteer for community lawyers in Compton, and that's where I really look at the value of kind of being able to engage people that are not typically engaged in the way of media or being at these panels in particular, or participating in the audience, to see how exactly they'll be able to engage in different ways and different forms. So through my internship at MALDEF, I work with the parent-school partnership in the education department, and I look at ways in which parents become actively engaged and become advocates for their children's education. And so I think that kind of reframes the discussion, and you typically have this conversation on Congress and the implementation of different programs and different bills and legislation. But in reality, how is the execution coming about? Do these things really function? Are you really able to to build a bridge between theory and praxis? And I think that that's where MALDEF and the type of work that I've done with community lawyers comes about, in that you really see that there are different forms of engagement, and particularly in the way of empowerment and allowing, not necessarily allowing, but introducing to parents that there are other ways to become empowered and to advocate for their child. And so I think that ends up kind of disrupting the political space and disrupting the really dominant space to really, not necessarily in the realm of representatives, but also having parents being advocates for themselves, for their families, and for their child's education. And so I think that that's where I really see the value. And once we hear the media, and we see the public discourse, but I think in reality, when you're actually really actively engaged, you see how parents can do that as well. You find that we have to reevaluate and reconfigure exactly what participation looks like, and if that's in the form of a vote, or if that's in the form of a parent going to the school district and advocating for bilingual education.
Well, it's a terrific point. Some of you may have been here earlier this fall when Ben Austin, the director of Parent Revolution, was here, talking about how the parents in some of the most challenged schools in Southern California have been transformed as a vote by their by the parents of the children in those schools. And the point that he made dovetails very closely with what Roxana was saying. He said many of the parents of the kids in these schools are not documented, and he said for many of them, their vote to change over their child's school was the first vote that they cast as Americans. And it might not be the way that we talk about voting in the more traditional, informal context, but it's a level of participation that I think Roxana is correct to bring up. Roberto, this might go a little bit further afield, but I know you've spent a lot of time over the years thinking and writing and watching these things. But the trajectory that Roxana was talking about, in terms of community involvement, ultimately leading to political participation, that's a fairly traditional arc for our country's various immigrant communities over the years, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to. I mean, I'm wary of discussions of American traditions as they come to immigration. And, we had an era of immigration that across the Atlantic that came to a very clear end, and it took place a long time ago in a very different country. And there are all kinds of dangers in looking back and drawing parallels and seeing that what happened then and what happened now are really have a lot to do with each other.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but just to clarify, I think you're right, the broader parallels can be very dangerous. But on this specific point, it seems reasonable, particularly as you listen to Roxana discuss it, that before traditional and formal political participation comes other types of involvement. No?
Yeah, and and let's forget the one interesting parallel that I think helps clarify the situation today is that during the transatlantic era, there were all kinds of mediating institutions, local government organizations, local parties in particular, religious churches, other religious organizations, ethnic solidarity organizations, that all had as an objective political activity. I mean, voting and being and you saw in the big urban centers where that population was concentrated, ethnic bloc voting that was very decisive in a whole series of benefits. It's how you got jobs in City Hall, the police department, the fire department, how you exercise control over public schools, etc. That has not happened nearly as clearly with this wave of immigration. And there are all kinds of interesting questions about that. One of the major factors in the fact that immigration reform has not moved over the course of the last 10 years is that the naturalization rate among Mexicans who are eligible to become U.S. citizens has barely budged, and remains lower by far than for any other nationality, and by far lower than was the pattern during the transatlantic era. It is a question of there is considerable discussion, trying to understand what's going on. It's been going on for a while and it persists, and it has persisted even after 5 years of very substantial enforcement, some people call it repression, that affects legal permanent residents. You know, you can be a legal permanent resident in this country if you have an aggravated felony, you can be on the bus. 3 misdemeanors, you can be on the bus. So people who are legal permanent residents and potentially eligible for citizenship have some exposure. Presumably there has been a great deal of rhetoric about Latino voting. You have to become a citizen to vote. The pool of political power that resides in people who are eligible for citizenship are legal permanent residents. They have lived here for 5 years. They have to pay $698, take an English test and a civics test, and they can vote. And yet don't. It would, explains one of the reasons why this is a stalemate. Had they voted, had they become citizens, this discussion would already be different. It would be different. You can even look at people who are citizens. The level of participation, although it's increased among Latino voters, is still far below that of any other ethnic group. So you have 2 big untapped pools of civic participation that are critical in trying to understand the nature of immigration politics from the neighborhood level to the federal level in this country. And it's hard to explain. People have all kinds of explanations. It's the fees, it's a sense of Mexican nationalism. And it is interesting that there's no other nationality in which you see such a low level of naturalization. And there is no ethnic group other than Latinos that persist at very low levels of political activity. So there's a huge amount of work to be done there that could be transformative. I mean, you're talking about latent political power that, if exercised, there's no question it would transform the nature of immigration policy, politics, and a lot of other things too. When you imagine, the last, how many elections has it been, Dan, that have been presidential elections that have been decided by margins of less than 4%? 2000, since 2000. And you're talking about, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of votes that are uncast in a political situation where the country is very closely divided between 2 very different views of government. So it's an enormous field that has to be done house to house because people have tried all kinds of other ways, big campaigns, other stuff. It's whatever the answer is. It may be really old style politics where you go and talk to somebody face to face and say, okay, you got to vote, or you've got to become a citizen.
We've been talking about these 2 separate tracks, the involvement, the community involvement that you're talking about, as far as it relates to the school system, the legal system, and so on, and then the political involvement. In your opinion, based on what you've seen in your internships, can the kind of community involvement that you see, can that lead to political involvement? Is it the first step toward political involvement, or are they on 2 separate tracks, 2 separate directions?
Well, in the way of working with parents, what I've seen, and this is a recent example based off of an interview that we had with a parent who's actually been very involved in at least the local control funding formula for LAUSD. And so what we see typically is that once through MALDEF's Parents Partnership Program, where it's actually a very structured program where one of the first steps is actually parents going to their child's school and requesting to get their permanent records to see their grades and being given the opportunity to actually challenge whatever's being placed on there. And so once I look at the binder, once I see the actual training that goes on, you see the types of levels where you begin to advocate for yourself. So it starts at the level of personal empowerment specifically, where you look at how you can work within these dominant legal functions. And so that's where I see that it can lead to political participation, because you have parents who start questioning, and it leads to questioning, the actual legal system, questioning LAUSD. Does the system work for me? Does it work for my child? And so you see the ways in which that kind of, it triggers some things in the parents. And I think that some of the things that the Parent School Partnership Program does are required, or at least are instrumental to actually having active political participation. So I think in that spirit of awakening, the rights of parents, regardless of their legal, their undocumented status or what have you, I think that awakening in itself gives people the opportunity to actually to potentially, get naturalized if they thought that before their vote didn't count, and for that reason they decided to remain as LPRs. And so I think in that realm, it's very, very effective, and the awakening, more than anything, is instrumental to political participation, and it goes hand in hand, which is why I feel that we shouldn't forget about the ways in which culture does affect the levels of participation.
Thank you. Cindy, I'd like to get your opinion on this. As you cover California's immigrant communities, and we get into these questions about community engagement and political participation, what do you see in here? What do you see in here on this front? Is politics the next step? Is it something that's not particularly relevant? Are there more immediate concerns that you find in talking to people? What do you see?
Well, I'll focus this on the citizenship question that Roberto raised. I actually did a story about this, and before I covered immigration, I just assumed that, people hit the 5-year mark and they, filled out their application and became citizens, because who wouldn't want to? So I went to a workshop for permanent residents to, start to apply. And it was quite stunning. And it wasn't just Mexicans. I mean, I talked to a Filipino guy, and they just said, some of them just said, I was busy. I was raising my kids. I was working. I didn't get around to it. Some of them aren't confident in their English. For some of them, the fee, which don't quote me on it, but I think it's like $600 something, is a real issue. They have to save up for months or years to, just even have that much. So, and I think in a more general sense, it points to the issue that always comes up with politics, is that people are just too busy living their lives and working and raising their families sometimes, and that's particularly true with immigrants who are trying to establish themselves in a new country.
Mike, you've spent a lot of time over the years looking to engage people in politics, not only on behalf of candidates, but often for more direct policy involvement, whether it's legislation or ballot initiatives. What kind of things can create an incentive for taking that step?
It's a great question. As a political practitioner who's actually in the business of getting people to vote for the past 20 years, we've struggled with, as the Latino vote has
How's that going so far?
I'm older. Look, there's an unfortunate trend line, and then I'll throw out some statistics here to kind of show just how challenging the situation is. But the few spikes in Latino turnout in elections happen when there is what I call a negative push from the community. When Prop 187, Prop 209, when the community is perceived that it's under attack, that's when we see these spikes pop up. Other than that, it falls back down to a very low number. As was pointed out early, that is growing at a very, very slow rate when you compare it to the pace of the population. As we all know, back in June, July of this year, Latinos surpassed whites as the plurality demographically in California. But all of our projections suggest that for the next 35 to 40 years, whites will be the majority of voters. Now, some of that is demographic, right? A lot of Latinos are under 18. A lot of them are going through the naturalization process or are here undocumented and may not have the opportunity to go through that process. But there is something bigger, and as was mentioned, this dynamic is very different than the transatlantic migrations that we saw 100 years ago. The number one difference, I think, well, there's really two, but the number one difference is the size, the scope, and the duration of this migratory wave. first and foremost. The second is you don't have to go take an old ocean liner across the ocean where you were never going to come back. There is some seamlessness amongst on the border, obviously a complicated one, but it is there. The other challenge is this. We don't have a lot of civic organizations in the Latino community, especially for when these great migratory waves came. Most of them tend to focus on immigrant rights, which as they should, civil rights, and to a lesser extent, but increasingly, voter engagement. Now, there's no, the Toastmasters, for example, and the Rotary clubs that started to emerge after second and third generations, after the transatlantic migratory waves, are going to be starting to happen now, as we're starting to see from the 1980s these great waves come. That's the sign of an emerging, more stable population, an emerging middle class. And to me, ultimately, the number one factor in Latinos' ability and not just Latinos, but all of the communities that are coming to California specifically, their ability to find greater civic engagement or to be more engaged civically is fundamentally an economic question. And that's always the challenge in uplifting the least amongst us and the poor and the immigrants and the voiceless, is those that have the greatest need don't usually have the institutions required to allow for their civic engagement. So you throw all of that into the petri dish, and I think what's happening is, while unfortunate, it's very predictable. The question really is going to be one of an economic question, and is that hopefully, if history is a guide, rises, then I think we're going to start to see more engagement.
I have about a dozen questions for each of our panelists, but out of fairness to them and you, I'm going to back off at this point. And as we always do in our programs, now I'd like to open it up to questions from any of you who have anything that you'd like to ask of our panelists. A couple quick reminders. Most of you heard these this morning, but just for the sake of reminder, number one, if you have a question and I call on you, please tell us who you are so we know who's joining the conversation. And second, if you heard something with which you disagreed and you intended to ask a question of that individual, we'd ask that you frame that question with the same respect and regard that you hope that they would show for you if they were disagreeing with you. So with that, let's open it up to your questions for now.
Thank you for your presentation. I'll ask Cindy Chang. She's the LA Times immigration reporter. So, subject of, let's see, I'm Eason Lee, by the way. I'm the legal Korean immigrant, long time ago. I worked very hard to get U.S. citizens. I had to have as a graduate degree, plus I had a license in California Federal, so it was a rough time. Anyway, my question is about the prospect for the future. What happened is what happened, but what we're gonna do for the future. Now, one thing I think is President Reagan, when he became president, he declared amnesty. And a lot of people say, no, it is not going to work. It's going to bring disaster to U.S., But it turned out it was so successful. He had a vision, he had a courage. He was able to convince people my amnesty will work, and it did. So what I'm asking is Cindy and the three panelists, can we have such a leader who has a vision and courage and wisdom to push through good immigration reform at this time or not?
Cindy, you were called out, so you get to go first. But we'd like to have the other panelists weigh in as well if you'd like. And it's a similar question that we discussed at the conclusion of the morning panel. Is if you had to make an off-the-record guess, what do you think the prospects are for comprehensive immigration reform coming out of Congress in the near to medium future?
Well, obviously, politics in Washington is very different than it was in 1986. But I'll go back to, my original point about public opinion in California changing so drastically pretty much, in that same time period. And, I think that that is going to happen nationally, and it's starting to already, but for the time being, you still have a lot of representatives who do not have many immigrants in their district. So they don't have much of an incentive to support immigration reform, and meanwhile, you know, they've got the Tea Party on their heels. So, you know, short term, I don't know. I mean, long term, I think it's a pretty good guess that we're going to be in a very different place. And I just want to make one point about 86. What a lot of people don't remember is that there were actually two other main components to that legislation. One was border security, and another was the E-Verify, where you know, businesses are supposed to check the documents that a potential employee presents to make sure they're in the country legally. And it's widely believed that, you know, while the amnesty was clearly good for a lot of people, you know, on an individual level, that the other two components didn't work, and that's why we're in this position that we are today. And so when you talk about, you know, a comprehensive bill like the one that passed the Senate versus, you know, piecemeal measures, if, you know, we create a path to citizenship, but we don't address some of the other issues, you know, as Rita pointed out in the first panel, these backlogs to get a visa, you know, to quote, do it the right way, you know, it's literally decades for some nationalities, and if you don't give people, you know, a quicker, easier way to come legally, then you're going to end up in the same place again.
And I want to come back to the predictions in just a moment, but I'd like to jump over to Mike for a second. Because Mike, we touched on this a little bit this morning, and I'll warn you guys again, reapportionment is the least interesting word in the English language, so we promise not to spend much time on it. But Cindy touched on a really important point that Jeff Gorell spoke to as well, is when the overwhelming majority of Republicans in Congress do not have a significant immigrant community in their districts, and therefore, in the narrowest of senses, relatively little incentive to have direct interaction with individuals and families from those communities. On the flip side, you have any number of Democrats with similarly small incentive to talk to business owners or farmers about their concerns as it relates to this issue.
Yeah.
Can California's redistricting, which has produced some greater level of cohesion on these issues, is that something that can be duplicated nationally?
Yeah, look, a couple of things. First, I don't know if incentive is the right word here. We have to remember 1986 and in 1964-65, the last time major immigration was tackled, most members didn't have huge immigrant populations either. And so it's not that people are voting based off of their incentive because they've got immigrant voters, because most of these folks, as we've just learned, aren't even going to be voted for 10 years, and a lot of these people won't even be in Congress because they'll have a different reapportionment. So I don't know. My point is this: whenever immigration reform is tackled, it's an opportunity for a country, this country, to define who it's going to be for the next generation. And that's really what we're in the midst of. Okay, I don't want to make it too grand or too epic or too sweeping, but the numbers based off of the districts and where we are at right now was entirely predictable. The last time I was in this room, I think it was in March of this year, and I was on a panel, and I was the naysayer who said, I think we've got maybe a 10% chance of getting something done. And everybody else was going, no, we're going to get it done in the next 30 days. No, we're not. And look, that doesn't mean it's a failure, by the way. And it was just pointed out, we may be at a time where, as I mentioned, the size and scope of the change that is happening at the pace it's happening, this might be best tackled in pieces. Because I don't believe you're going to find, with the current redistricting and with the demographics, knowing as much as we do about the demographics of each district, each House district, that you're ever going to get a comprehensive package done the way I think many of us in this room would like to see done. That doesn't mean it's a failure. It might mean we get better policy out of it if we tackle it in pieces to make sure that those, like, you know, the 86 challenges might get better addressed. So maybe it's me being Pollyannish, I just prefer to see it that way. I think where we are at is entirely predictable, and I think going forward, we can, you know, guess with a pretty good high degree of certainty that It's not going to be the Senate package that was going to get done next year. It's going to be 1 or 2 small pieces that will set the table for the next pieces to get done later on.
Roberto, in the 80s and 90s, this was an issue of not exclusive, but primary interest to the states of California and Texas and Florida. And over the last generation, it has evolved into an issue of national scope and impact. Are there lessons to be learned from the policy debates of the 80s and 90s that we can apply going forward here?
You know, the primary lesson that was applied from there was significant action in the mid-1980s and then often forgotten, really significant legislation in the mid-1990s, was in 1990 itself, a big provision of legal immigration. So there was a lot of activity. The lesson that was drawn that now is certainly being questioned is that this is an issue that is best addressed all at once. That you have to get all the pieces in balance so that one of the failures, the 1986 bill was basically aimed at restricting the unauthorized flows and then giving an amnesty to the population that was here. But it didn't address future flows. It created no future pathway for low-skilled workers. And so what it did, that as labor demand increased in this country, then people came through unauthorized channels which had persisted. So the idea was now in the current round, which I really started very soon after George W. Bush became president. He was the last president who had very vivid personal interest in this issue. There's only been one since, so in any case, was the notion that you have to do it all at once. You try and get all these pieces. You have to have enforcement. You clean up the mess of the unauthorized population. You create future flows so that all future arrivals come through some legal channel or another. And you create a whole bunch of different kinds of permanent, temporary, employment-based, family-based channels that try and absorb the entire flow. So that was the logic of it. The political ground shifted, and the personalities changed. So going back to the gentleman's question, which about presidential leadership, one of the questions that has arisen in retrospect after what's happened over the last 14 months or so is this an issue that requires presidential leadership? There are some issues that's generally thought to make them move requires the political authority, the presumed political authority that presidents usually have, or the ability to break logjams, to make proposals, to create special envoys to Congress, to do something when there's a stalemate. Typically, in a functioning Washington, the president can step in and say, all right, I will do things to break a stalemate. I will propose something. Or I will send somebody to the Hill and say, we're going to sit here and talk until we settle it. This president, interestingly, and the biographers will be working on this for quite some time. If you look at his resume, you would think this is exactly the person who would have a sensitivity to the immigration issue and be deeply concerned about it, given that his father was foreign-born, that he spent part of his childhood overseas, that he has this complicated sense of identity, which he's written about very eloquently, which is in many ways mimics the identity of an immigrant, that he came to discover his own sense of American identity really when he moved to the mainland and when he hadn't in his adolescence. All these reasons to think that Barack Obama would be somebody who would have a natural avocation to this issue. He never has. I mean, it's clear now when we talk to people back then, he was a law professor in Chicago. He was never interested in this issue. And amazingly isn't interested now. It has been beyond passive. I mean, he has been studiously uninvolved, aside from giving little talks to people saying, there is no White House proposal in this entire realm of discussion. The White House has, aside from one speech in Las Vegas last January where he laid out broad principles, the president has never publicly said what he's for. So this is an experiment in tackling a really, one of those areas, as Michael was saying, that has lots of implications for many, many different groups, and seeing if you can do it without a precedent. I mean, you know, I'm saying this with a smile because it's an absurd thought. And the question is, I mean, doesn't feel like he's got any skin in the game. People keep waiting to see what's it going to take. A lot of activity behind the scenes, and people on the White House staff, and some significant people on the White House staff, have been inside players at key points throughout the last year. But publicly, it's peculiar. And he has not expressed himself the way we have had two presidents in the whole, really, of American history who have taken a personal interest in this issue and have voiced a personal vision of it. One was Ronald Reagan and one was George W. Bush. If you have never listened to Ronald Reagan's farewell address to the nation, I encourage you, just Google it. Ronald Reagan farewell address and watch the whole thing. And you will, A, be exposed to a level of political rhetoric we haven't seen in years. But besides that, the end of it is, if you're interested in immigration, if you're an immigrant yourself or you care about this issue, it'll make you weep. It is the most passionate declaration by a president from the Oval Office saying, you know, he starts out invoking the city on the hill. John Winthrop sitting, you know, in Massachusetts Bay, envisioning, about to land in the United States, speaking of this country as this divine place, created for a purpose. And he says, I use this expression all the time. People ask me what I thought of that. And he goes on and says, describes the city thriving with people from all over the world, full of commerce, full of different languages. And he says that if that city had walls, those walls would have doors, and if there were doors, those doors would be open to anybody who had the will to get here. I mean, it's stunning. I mean, and Obama couldn't begin to say things like that. So you wonder, what is it? I mean, it's a very good point that was raised about what's the role of presidential leadership in something that deals so fundamentally with the nation's identity and its long-term purpose. And we're, like I said, we're in the midst of this sort of strange experiment of trying to figure out whether you can deal with this subject and without a leader. You know, there's nobody, you know, I'll continue this only for one more moment. The last round in this period of debate was in 2006, 2007, where there was a champion. Teddy Kennedy assumed the role of in Congress, and you had a president who was intimately concerned about this issue. I mean, George W. Bush made this, unfortunately, he tried something else first. He tried to privatize Social Security, and then he turned to immigration. Never mind. And he started two wars before that, but never mind. He did eventually get to this issue and throw himself wholeheartedly into it. And you had somebody in Congress who was a very powerful figure and a very public figure who was committed to it. And then it ended in stalemate. So it's an interesting question about American politics. Can you do something without leaders? And this issue is leaderless. There's nobody who speaks for it. And I don't think you can, you know, that may be the fatal flaw, that you can't do politics without leaders. And even as far as we've gotten in the media age, all the changes, all the polarization, the factional, and everything else, it may come down to the fact that there's not a champion. There's not a guy on a white horse or a woman on a white horse who's saying, okay, we're going that way. and people are willing to follow.
I encourage you send them to the Unruh Institute website and have them watch both panel discussions in their entirety, but I think in particular Roberto Suro's closing soliloquy. I make fun of him because he's a longtime friend, but I can't think of a better way of framing the issue. And I think you served the question that laid the groundwork for it. One of the courses I teach here at SC is a course called Case Studies in Modern Leadership. And every year, as one of their tasks, my students define leadership. And the way they define leadership in the context of politics is they say a political leader is someone who's willing to lose his or her office in order to do what they consider to be the right thing.
Take a little risk.
Sorry?
Even take a little risk.
Okay, you've lowered the bar a bit.
Well, at this stage.
But and if you listen to Roberto carefully, what it was very clear to me is he was not simply talking about President Obama, but a whole range of would-be political leaders from across the ideological spectrum who simply decided that this is something that is too dangerous and too risky to take on. And what that leads me to is a coda that some of you have heard me repeat many times over your years here at USC, that I believe more than anything that I've learned over the years, is that politics is too important to be left to the politicians. And if you're going to make these fixes, that it requires the kind of community and local and state work and engagement that our panelists have been talking about. One of the other courses I teach here is a course called The Future of California. And what I believe in the years I've been teaching that class is in order for our students to understand the future of California, they have to understand the history of California. And when you look back at the history of California, not just over 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 years, but over 500 years, over half a millennium, you'll realize that California has always been a boom and bust state. We have always been a roller coaster ride. Our highs are always higher than everybody else, and our lows are always lower. And the reason for that is because when California thrives, when California succeeds, it's when we recognize the energy and the optimism and enthusiasm of our newest arrivals, whether from other parts of this country or other parts of the world. And when we bottom out, it's when we forget that. There's a great quote from Steve Jobs that many of you have heard. Steve Jobs used to talk about the importance of putting a dent in the universe. And so California, at its best, is smart enough to recognize that when these smart, optimistic, ambitious people come here from other places, the best thing we can do is give them crowbars. Give them the tools, give them the education, give them the grounding in order to succeed. And again, when we forget that, that's when we tend to bottom out. You heard me mention this morning, for those of you who are here, one of my favorite quotes from Mark Twain. He says, history doesn't repeat itself, it just rhymes. And it is instructive as we watch California, as Mike was talking about earlier, coming to terms with this debate finally, after some very difficult and ugly and wrenching periods leading up to this. Watching the rest of the country going through the same difficult stages that we did in years past. Last point I'll make on this is to cite, as Cindy did earlier, is to cite a USC Dornsife LA Times poll that we did not too long ago. At the depths of the recession in 2009, we took a poll in which we asked Californians not who they preferred in a campaign for governor or for Senate, or whether they were going to vote yes or no on a ballot initiative. We asked them about themselves. We asked them about their futures. We asked them about their economic prospects. And at the depths of the recession, as you might suspect, as you might remember, Californians were a pretty dour bunch. And Californians overwhelmingly were very discouraged and very pessimistic about their economic futures and about the economic prospects for their state. There were two exceptions to those trends. And those two exceptions were the youngest Californians, Californians aged 18 to 25, and the newest Californians, most specifically first and second generation Latino and Asian Pacific Islander groups. When we dug a little bit further, we asked people about how the recession had impacted them. And of course, everybody had been hurt by the recession. Have you lost a job? Have you lost hours at work? Have you put off the purchase of a car or a major appliance? Have you missed a mortgage payment? Do you know someone who suffered these things? Everybody had, or knew somebody who had. Interestingly enough, the two groups that had suffered more than any others were the youngest Californians and the newest Californians. And so I think it's worth remembering when you talk about this broader issue, and I'm guilty of this just like many of us are. We tend to get lost in the congressional maneuvering imaginations. That when you talk about the issue of immigration, you are talking about optimism. And if the youngest and newest Californians who are most adversely impacted by California's Great Recession are those who are still most optimistic about the state's future and their own economic prospects, the very least the rest of us can do is give them the crowbars so they can go put a dent in their universe and bring California, United States, to a level that it deserves to be. Join me in thanking our panelists. Join me in thanking Cindy Chang, Roberto, Suro, Roxana, Ontiveros, and Michael. Thanks as well to Justin and our partners at the Political Student Assembly, to Helen Torres and the rest of her team at Hope, and thanks also to my team at the Unruh Institute, to Laura Hill, to Jody Epstein, to Amy, to Luca, and especially to Adrena Hidalgo for the work that they did in putting together today's program. Let's give them a round of applause. And thanks finally to all of you. This is our final program for the semester, but we will be back in January, and we'll hope you will join us then for a series of conversations on these and another range of policy and political topics. Have a great Thanksgiving and a Happy New Year.